This podcast contains adult themes and graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised.
A commercial-free version of this podcast is available on Patreon for $1 per month. Patreon.com/Beyond Contempt Podcast. I'm Renee, and this is Beyond Contempt True Crime. I only just heard about this case a few weeks ago when I stumbled down an internet rabbit hole. This is one of the more horrible cases I've covered. Consider yourself warned. You're listening to episode 33, The Richmond Spree Murders. Treva Terrell was born on May 19, 1970, in Washington, Pennsylvania, to parents Marna Terrell Squires and William Jackson. She dropped out of school during her sophomore year. Treva had 4 sons, Troy, Gregory, Giovan, and Tyree, all in quick succession. She had done time in Alexandria, Virginia, for committing some smaller-time crimes. Treva was looking to get back on her feet. After she was released from jail, she moved into the safety of her mom and stepfather's home with her 4 children. Marna knew her daughter was a dichotomy and vacillated between keeping on the straight and narrow path and then falling off into bad patterns she couldn't seem to quit. Treva would go through periods of accomplishment, where she earned her GED and landed an outstanding job as an admin at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And she would be attentive to her kids, taking them bowling and roller skating and attending their basketball games. But then she would falter and fall into old habits of using drugs and chasing after men who were not good for her or her family. In 1999, Treva met a man named Ricky Gray when he was on a break from prison. Their time together was short-lived when Ricky went back in to serve time on federal drug charges. But Treva kept up their correspondence even when Ricky was behind bars. Marna and John Squires wanted to keep their grandkids near, so they bought Treva a home close by. Ricky Gray was released from prison early in 2005 and showed up at Treva's home that April. Treva Terrell was in love, but her parents had an uneasy feeling about him. Ricky started out on an honest path. He got a job at a telemarketing firm and was taking electrician classes at the same time. In summer 2005, the couple got married. Treva, the boys, and the new husband switched homes with her parents, since her mom's place was larger, and they were now a household of 6. The honeymoon phase of the relationship didn't last long. Gray often screamed at the boys for being too rowdy and kept tight tabs on Treva because he thought she was cheating on him. He stopped attending class and quit his telemarketing job. On October 26, 2005, Gray's nephew Ray Dandridge was released from prison after serving 10 years for armed robbery and immediately went to see his uncle. Treva's mom Marna told Ray that he could stay for a few days, but Ray stretched that invitation out for much longer, much to the discomfort of the Squires. Marna's husband John saw Gray and Dandridge for what they were, jobless con men. Between constantly pestering the Squires for cash and their violent tempers, the Squires were not pleased with their new house guest and son-in-law. Treva confided in her mom she made a mistake, and Ricky Gray was not who she thought he was. Treva said she wanted him to move out, which pleased her mom. Meanwhile, Gray and Dandridge were just doing what they did best when they were together, committing robberies and beating up people. Gray wasn't too discerning where he enacted these crimes. He roughed up one of their neighbors so bad that the neighbor went to the hospital. Gray realized that the honeymoon was over, and he figured Treva would kick him out. Then he thought if she was gone, he could stay longer. On November 4th, 2005, Marna was going to watch the boys while her daughter and Gray went out drinking that night. When they returned home from the bar, they were both drunk and high. While Treva was putting herself to bed, Gray called Dandridge and told him to come over to the house. Gray went to the bedroom with a metal pipe and repeatedly beat Treva with it. He slipped a plastic bag over her head and secured it in place until she was still. They backed Treva's minivan up the driveway to the garage and put her lifeless body in the back. They didn't drive very far and brazenly discarded her body by a used car business within eyeshot of many neighborhood houses. 35-year-old Treva Terrell Gray's badly beaten and bruised body was found on November 5, 2005, by a person from that neighborhood. Police questioned the family, and the Squires communicated that their daughter had a contentious relationship with Gray. They fought much of the time. Police interviewed both Gray and Dandridge, who were both persons of interest, and claimed they had not been in contact with Treva for several days. But police could not put together enough evidence to make an arrest. They ruled her death as suspicious, but the investigation stalled. Marna Squires was upset and felt that the Washington, Pennsylvania police insinuated that a drug overdose contributed to Treva's death. Ricky Gray played the concerned, widowed husband and kept checking in with his mother-in-law to ask if she had heard any updates from the police. Marna noticed scratches on Gray's arms and confronted him. He blew her off and called them passion marks. Even though John and Marna were afraid of the two criminals living in their home, they asked Dandridge to move out, which he promptly did. Dandridge went to live with his dad and stepmom in Philadelphia. It took Marna longer to get rid of Gray, but he moved out on December 23, 2005, and went back to Arlington to live at his grandma's place. The next day, Marna picked up the phone and called Ricky Gray's parole officer. She felt Gray had something to do with the death of her daughter. The Squires were glad to be rid of the two men, and eventually moved back into their larger home that they had given up to Treva and her family. The place was a disaster. Marna found vomit on the floor, bloodstains on a pillowcase, and a plastic bag on the floor. She assumed the mess was from the kids, so she dutifully cleaned everything up, not realizing she destroyed all evidence. It was Christmas Day, and Gray and Dandridge were reunited. Dandridge moved in with Gray in Arlington. He introduced Gray to his girlfriend, Ashley, whom he had met through the prison pen pal system. She recently finished serving time for federal drug charges. It didn't take long for Ashley to drop Dandridge and fall in love with his uncle Ricky Gray. She told Dandridge not to despair. She would set him up with her good friend LaToya. Dandridge and Gray wasted little time. Just a few days later, they were looking for a victim that they could easily pick off. 25-year-old Ryan Carey just finished work on New Year's Eve. He parked his car and was walking to his parents' house in Arlington. Two figures emerged from the shadows, and Ryan was immediately punched in the face before he could even process what was happening. Ryan quickly conceded to his attackers and handed them his wallet and keys. Despite his acquiescence, the attack continued and turned brutal. Ryan was forced to the ground and repeatedly stabbed in his neck, chest, and arms. The attack was so horrific that they broke knives off in his body. Ryan's father, David Carey, heard the commotion outside of his front door. When he peered outside, he saw his son stumbling to the porch, saying something to the effect that they have knives. David grabbed a baseball bat he stored nearby and chased after the attackers, but they ran off into the night. Ryan ended up in a 2-week coma. His hospital stay lasted 2 months, and he permanently lost the use of his right arm. Later on in court, when Ryan described the attack, he said that he could feel the knives penetrating his face, neck, and the bottom of his mouth. David Carey said the attack permanently changed his son, and he was never the same after it. It was January 1st, 2006. Johnny Hott was heading over to the Harvey family home. The Harveys were having their annual New Year's Day chili party. Johnny Hott and Brian Harvey were good friends and bandmates. He arrived at the Harvey home around 1:45, only to find that the house was burning and thick black smoke was filling up the 2-story brick home in Richmond, Virginia. Johnny called 911. When firefighters arrived, they faced intense heat and a loss of visibility due to the nature of the fire. They pulled out 2 bodies from the basement, one adult and one child. The deceased victims had been bound, so the rescue effort ceased. By the time the fire was out, there were 4 dead people who were identified as the Harvey family. What had been done to this family was truly awful. Lisa Beatles was at the Harvey house that afternoon, working the case. She was a veteran detective who had seen many terrible tragedies during her career. But she remembered that almost every firefighter, officer, or first responder on the scene had tears running down their face. The autopsies told the story of what this family endured in their last minutes alive. 49-year-old Brian Harvey had been gagged, and they taped his mouth shut. They cut his neck 8 times, but these were not the injuries that killed him. Brian's head sustained several lacerations and blows that were delivered from a hammer, which caused his death. He also had 3rd-degree burns. Brian's wife, 39-year-old Catherine Harvey, had her neck and chest cut 3 times, and there was also one cut to her back. These wounds did not kill her. She too had multiple lacerations on the head and a fracture above her eyes that was delivered via hammer. Blood was seen behind her eyes. She passed away from blunt force trauma to the head. Catherine and Brian's oldest daughter, 9-year-old Stella Ann Harvey, had 6 cut marks to her neck, which penetrated her esophagus and trachea. She sustained several blows from a hammer that were delivered with enough force that brain tissue was observed outside of her skull. She passed away from both blunt force trauma, smoke inhalation, and carbon monoxide poisoning. 4-year-old Ruby Marie Harvey was their younger daughter. Her throat also had been cut so deeply that it penetrated her trachea. This injury did not kill her, but likely impeded her breathing. Like her sister, her skull was fractured so significantly that brain tissue was observed on the outside of her skull. They had stabbed her in the back so deeply that the knife penetrated her ribs and pierced her lungs. Her death was caused from the blunt force trauma to the head and the lung puncture. In the basement, law enforcement found 2 broken wine bottles, a knife handle and blade, and 2 claw hammers. There were only a few items missing from the Harveys' home: some cash, a laptop, and Brian's wedding ring. The Harveys' memorial service was well attended, with 1,400 people showing up to pay their respects to the family. People in the community dropped flowers and dolls off in front of Kathy's business. Memorial candles lined the curb in front of their home. Crimes like this didn't happen in the Woodland Heights area of Richmond. It was one of the safest areas in the city, and there hadn't been a murder there in nearly 20 years. The Bryants had been a part of that community for a long time. Kathy co-owned a store called World of Mirth. It was an indie toy store and gift shop where kids could spend time with their parents while playing with toys. Kathy did not allow any violent toys like guns or swords. Kathy's half-brother was actor Stephen Culp, who had roles in The West Wing and Desperate Housewives. Kathy grew up in the Kings Grant neighborhood in Virginia Beach. She was on the homecoming court for her sophomore year of high school. Junior year, her classmates voted her as the most likely student to succeed. Her senior year, she was the class secretary, was voted homecoming queen, and was nominated as the most beautiful in the school yearbook. Kathy moved to Richmond to attend the Virginia Commonwealth University, where she received a degree in painting and printmaking. She worked a few different jobs. Kathy painted sets for the community theater and worked as a pastry chef and server at the Border Cafe. Brian and his bandmate Johnny Hott were regulars at the Border Cafe, and that is where Brian met his future wife. Brian was in a semi-famous band called House of Freaks with his good friend Johnny Hott. It was a two-piece group where Johnny played drums and Brian guitar. Johnny also found a bit of success in the ever-rotating cast of musicians in the band Cracker, which formed in the early 1990s. But Brian and Johnny's band, House of Freaks, received accolades from Rolling Stone magazine that stated the duo paved the way for bands like the White Stripes and the Black Keys. Brian and Kathy married in 1990, and they started having children a few years later. Stella was born in 1996, and Ruby was born in 2001. Brian always lovingly said that Stella was a handful, but she was a thoughtful young lady. Sometimes Brian would sit on his piano with Stella on his lap, and they would tap on the keys together. Ruby loved the color green, but she always wore sparkly red shoes, so the Harveys naturally nicknamed her Ruby Red. Brian slowly shifted away from being a full-time musician once he became a father. Early on, he tried to run his own business and set up a tiki-themed coffee house in the back of Kathy's store. Brian was not so great at being a businessman. Kathy realized that he was spending more time discussing music with people instead of waiting on his customers. They shut the coffee shop down, and Brian had to think about getting a proper job. So he took a job working on computers for the county's school system. Their home on Richmond's south side was idyllic. Their 2-story red brick house was complete with a porch swing and large older trees. The Harveys had many friends in the neighborhood, and they often left their door open. They always encouraged friends to drop in any time. The Harveys could have never predicted that this open-door policy would lead to grave trouble. Brian had a music gig on New Year's Eve, and he returned home around 2 a.m. He needed to get some sleep since they were having their annual New Year's Day party that afternoon. When Brian got up in the morning, he went outside and grabbed the newspaper. When he came inside, he left the door slightly ajar, which was a normal practice in their home. As Brian was enjoying his newspaper, Dandridge Gray and Gray's new girlfriend, Ashley Baskerville, were driving around in a van, scoping out the neighborhood. Around 9 a.m., they spotted a red brick home with a door that was slightly open and parked the van down the block. Ashley stayed in the van and served as a lookout while the two men headed for the Harveys' home. They walked inside and caught Brian by surprise. Gray and Dandridge feigned car trouble, but the ploy didn't last long because the knife that they brought was on full display for Brian and Kathy to see. Gray and Dandridge ordered Brian, Kathy, and Ruby to the basement. Stella wasn't there yet, as she was still at a sleepover at a friend's house. Brian was tied and gagged right away, as Dandridge ransacked the home. Gray promised them that no one would be hurt as long as everyone was cooperative. In the middle of the home invasion, the doorbell rang. Kathy knew it was probably Stella, who was home from her sleepover. Kathy persuaded Gray to let her go upstairs and intercept her friend before they came in the house. Gray allowed it, but he warned that he would kill Ruby and Brian if she tried anything. Kathy went upstairs, and Stella was inside the house along with her friend, Grace Lynn, and Grace Lynn's mom, Kristen. Stella greeted her mom and ran downstairs to look for the rest of the family. Grace Lynn tried to follow Stella down the stairs, but Kathy blocked her and made up an excuse that she wasn't feeling well. As Kristen and Grace Lynn left the Harveys, Kristen told Kathy that they would come back over in a few hours to help with the preparations for the afternoon chili party. When Kathy went downstairs, she clutched both of her children. The kids were getting upset, so Kathy told Gray and Dandridge to take whatever they wanted and leave. As Gray tied Kathy and the girls up, the girls were increasingly agitated and were screaming and kicking. Gray lost his patience, pulled out a razor blade, and slit Kathy, Stella, Ruby, and Brian's throats, which did not kill them. Gray used the Harvey's claw hammer and a kitchen knife to finish what he started. Gray and Dandridge tipped over an art easel, poured a few bottles of wine on it, and started it on fire. They went back to the van and drove over to Ashley's parents' house. Her mom and dad refused to let them in and disapproved of their daughter hanging out with ex-convicts. The trio changed course and headed over to see Ashley's friend LaToya. They were old friends and met years ago when they both served time in a detention center. We're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsors. Thank you to Best Fiends for sponsoring this episode of Beyond Contempt True Crime. If you are a true crime podcast listener, you probably heard about Best Fiends, and maybe you've even thought about getting in on the action. Well, let me tell you all about it. It's a popular and engaging puzzle game that you play on your phone. It's a laid-back game, and not as intense as some of the podcasts that we all like to listen to. Best Fiends keeps adding new levels and events every single month, so they keep it entertaining. I find that it's a great game to play when true crime stories get a little too heavy and I need to take a break. And you don't even need to be tethered to Wi-Fi, because you can play it without an internet connection. Engage your brain with fun puzzles and collect tons of cute characters. Trust me, with over 100 million downloads, this 5-star rated mobile puzzle game is a must-play. Download Best Fiends free from the Apple App Store or in Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. Hi everyone. I really need to tell you about BetterHelp Online Counseling. It's an affordable service where you can connect with one of their licensed professional therapists. You can find counselors that specialize in just about anything, including anxiety, depression, family conflicts, trauma, and LGBTQ issues. I work from home and barely leave my house, so it's great that you can communicate with your counselor from the privacy of your own home. BetterHelp is more affordable than traditional in-person counseling, and financial aid is available. So many people have been using BetterHelp that they are recruiting additional counselors in all 50 states, and you can start talking with your counselor in less than 24 hours. I want you to start living a happier life today. As a listener, you'll get 10% off your first month by visiting betterhelp.com/beyondcontempt. Join over 1 million people taking charge of their mental health. Again, that's betterhelp.com/beyondcontempt. Now, back to the show. Lilla Ann Pauley arrived home at her Chesterfield County apartment she shared with her daughter LaToya and her 5-year-old grandson Marvin. LaToya's old friend, Ashley Baskerville, was there with 2 men that Lilla did not recognize. The 2 strangers laid it on thick. When Lilla was taking groceries out of her car, the men grabbed her bags and said that a lovely lady should not have to carry groceries into her home. Gray, Dandridge, and Baskerville then made themselves at home for the next few days. Lilla Ann wasn't a fan of Ashley because Ashley said wildly inappropriate things to Lilla Ann's grandson. LaToya saw Dandridge with a laptop, and he was deleting photos from a hard drive. It took LaToya a little time to process what she was seeing, but those photos were of a white family celebrating Christmas and opening presents. LaToya snuck into her mother's room early the next morning and said she suspected that their house guests were involved in that crime that was all over the news. Lilla Ann Pauley was so frightened that she and LaToya decided that calling the police would put them in more danger if their house guests were indeed involved in a crime. Dandridge mentioned to LaToya that Gray had grown tired of Ashley and he was thinking about killing her. LaToya didn't think he was serious and never told her friend or involved the police. On January 3, 2006, in Chesterfield County, Virginia, there was a knock on Roy Mason and Brenda Dale's door. 1 second, someone was asking for directions. Then the next second, 2 men and 1 woman forced their way into the house. Gray, Dandridge, and Baskerville ransacked the place. Roy talked the intruders out of tying them up, since his partner Brenda had MS and was wheelchair-bound. The intruders took a computer game, a TV, a DVD player, a computer, and $800 in cash, which Brenda brought into the house earlier in the day after she cashed her Social Security disability check. Gray, Dandridge, and Baskerville left without incident. On January 6, 2006, Ashley hatched a plan. She told Gray that her stepfather had molested her when she was a little girl, so she wanted the group to rob her parents, and she had a key to their house. The idea was to tie Ashley up and have her play along so her parents wouldn't suspect she was part of the crime. Unfortunately, Ashley wasn't aware that Gray and Dandridge had another plan that they had not included her in. The trio entered the house, and Gray tied up Purcell Tucker and Mary Baskerville. Dandridge took Ashley to her room and tied her up, and it irritated her that he had tied her so tight. Gray and Dandridge rummaged through the house and found TVs, speakers, radios, jewelry, and cash. Gray stabbed and slashed Mary and Purcell. Dandridge walked down to Ashley's room, and he suffocated her to death. They loaded up Purcell's green Chevy Blazer with stolen items. The two men hit the road and headed for Dandridge's father's place in Philadelphia. A few days had passed, and there were no leads on the Harvey murders. Police thought that maybe this was a revenge killing, since the crime was so personal, and there were no signs of forced entry into the Harveys' home. They honed in on Brian's friend and bandmate Johnny Hott. He was the person who called 911, and he lived close to the Harveys. They questioned Johnny for several days, asking him why their band had broken up, and questioning him about some of the lyrics to their songs. Johnny was so fed up with this line of questioning that he lawyered up. On January 6, 2006, LaToya Pauley kept calling her friend Ashley, but all the calls went to voicemail, and she never received a call back. She called Dandridge, and he told her that Ashley went bye-bye. LaToya reported this to her mom, Lil Ann, and Lil Ann called the police. Detectives interviewed the Pauleys for a few hours and were very interested in the pictures that had been erased off the laptop by Dandridge. LaToya asked them to check on her friend Ashley, as she genuinely feared for her safety. When the police arrived at the Tucker Baskerville home, they were disheartened with what they discovered. Ashley and Mary Baskerville and Purcell Tucker were bound, gagged, and dead. A sock had been thrust into Purcell's mouth and was secured by duct tape. His head had been covered in saran wrap. Mary's eyes had been covered with duct tape. She was gagged, and there were wounds on her neck and chest. Ashley's head was enclosed in a plastic shopping bag that had been held in place with duct tape. She had also been gagged with a sock. 46-year-old Mary Baskerville was employed by a dry cleaning business. She loved going to church and attended almost every service. 55-year-old Purcell drove a forklift for his employer. He enjoyed music and played the guitar. Purcell was well known in his friend circle for his delicious pie baking skills. 21-year-old Ashley Baskerville grew up mostly inside the Virginia penal system. She hung around friends that were bad influences and was taking drugs by age 10. 2 years later, she was in the custody of social services. She spent most of her teens bouncing in and out of Richmond detention centers. Her father, James, was not in the picture. Her mother and stepdad felt that they could not exert any parental control over her. In September 2002, she celebrated her 18th birthday, and shortly after was arrested for possession of cocaine with intent to distribute and larceny. A few weeks later, she slipped up again when she sold crack to a police informant. She went to federal prison and was released back to her parents in March 2005. The hope was that she would rebuild her life in the stability of her parents' home. But that ultimately didn't work out when she hooked up with Gray in Dandridge. When police discovered that she was deceased, they found a wedding band that hung around Ashley's neck. It was Brian Harvey's ring. This solidified who law enforcement was looking for. A few blocks away from the Tucker Baskerville home, they found an abandoned van that belonged to Treva Terrell Gray. The police asked LaToya to call Dandridge so they could trace the call. Not only were police able to trace the call to Philadelphia, Dandridge also spoke candidly about the murders. On January 7th, the SWAT team was called in, and Roland Wilson's home was surrounded. His son had showed up unannounced the night before with his uncle Ricky Gray. The Wilsons were not aware that Gray and Dandridge had committed any crimes, but the blazer they showed up in was loaded with all kinds of merchandise. Ray Dandridge did not resist arrest and surrendered to police without incident. Ricky Gray was another story. He was in the basement, crouched behind a water heater. When he was asked to raise his hands up, he took a swing at the officer, then tried to grab for the officer's gun. A scuffle ensued where punches were thrown and Gray was pepper sprayed and ultimately handcuffed. Ray Dandridge admitted to his role in murdering Marion Ashley Baskerville and Purcell Tucker. About 12 hours after his arrest, Ricky Gray confessed to murdering the Harvey family. He eventually confessed to brutalizing Ryan Carey, killing the Tuckers and his girlfriend Ashley, and also killing his wife Tereva. On January 8, 2006, police knew that Ashley Baskerville took part in the Harvey murders by standing lookout from the vehicle. She took part in the Chesterfield robbery of Roy Mason and Brenda Dale, and directly entered the home and took their possessions. And she played a role in the robbery of her parents. They verified this from a mix of evidence, eyewitness identifications, and confessions. Gray and Dandridge were both charged on February 9, 2006. They worked out a deal between all the legal camps. They charged Dandridge with the Tucker Baskerville murders, and they charged Gray with the murder of the Harveys. Even though the death penalty was on the table, Gray pleaded not guilty. His legal team had little to work with. Gray had confessed to the crimes. He told the police where to find evidence, including a cookie plate, a basket, and computer that belonged to the Harvey family. Brian and Stella Harvey's DNA and Ryan Carey's DNA were both found on Gray's boots. Gray claimed that he was high on PCP when he committed all the crimes. A psychiatrist evaluated him and acknowledged that Gray heard voices and believed this to be evidence of a PCP-induced psychosis. Ricky Gray's trial began late summer 2006. He showed no emotion through the duration of the trial, which didn't win the jury over. The key strategy for the defense was to show that physical and sexual abuse endured by Gray as a child changed the trajectory of his life and turned him into a damaged adult who lacked moral judgment and impulse control. 29-year-old Ricky Giovan Gray was born on March 9, 1977, to Barbara Morton and Ellsworth Gray. They named him Ellsworth Jr., but that was quickly changed to Ricky by his mom. She found that Ellsworth had stepped out in the relationship and fathered another child already named Ellsworth Jr. Barbara left Ellsworth for a while, but then got back together with him again, and in hindsight, she considered that a poor decision. In the Gray household, alcoholism, substance abuse, neglect, abuse, and sexual assault were constant themes. Ellsworth often wielded a leather horse strap, and he would beat Ricky with it for anything from getting into trouble at school or even wetting the bed, which he did until he was 13. But if the leather strap wasn't available, a piece of PVC pipe was used, or any object that Ellsworth grabbed. Family members saw the bruising and the damage on Ricky's body, but they felt they couldn't intervene or didn't know what they could do to stop the abuse. Ricky was disruptive in school, which got him into trouble. He was diagnosed with hyperactivity and was prescribed Ritalin. Ricky's mother, Barbara, joined the Army and was working in Arlington as a chaplain's assistant. When Ricky was 4, the Army transferred his mom away from Arlington, and she left her kids behind with Ellsworth. Ricky's stepbrother, Fitzgerald Gray, sexually abused him and his sister, Ava. Ricky was so often sexually assaulted that he had a negative reaction to the smell of Vaseline. Fitzgerald forced Ava and Ricky to watch porn, and also required Ricky to watch as Fitzgerald sexually assaulted Ava. At age 8, Ricky would often go to his father's brothel, where he was assaulted and sexually abused by the working girls. At age 9, he started drinking alcohol. And at 11, he was using PCP. His nephew, Ray Joseph Dandridge, was less than a year younger than him and was born on January 24, 1977. By the time Ricky was age 12, they were both using drugs like marijuana, cocaine, and PCP. His father, Ellsworth, had been modeling this behavior for his children and was a full-blown cocaine addict. Later on, he was arrested and went to prison on a drug conviction. When Barbara returned home from her Army assignment, she learned that Ellsworth's son had been sexually abusing her kids, although Ricky refused to speak about any of it. Ricky spent his freshman year at Washington and Lee High School, which was one of the top schools in the area. He transferred to a military academy in Woodstock, Virginia, perhaps being influenced by his mother's military service. He cut his time as a junior Navy cadet short and dropped out of school in his sophomore year. Ricky decided that he was just going to work and had a variety of jobs, including cleaning carpets and driving people to the airport. Ricky's nephew Ray didn't last very long in school either. He also attended a top high school in Arlington and stopped going during his sophomore year. Later on, a forensic psychologist diagnosed him as being a slow learner, likely because of his low IQ. His mother, Ingrid, was Ricky Gray's older sister. Sometimes she would send Ray to Philadelphia to spend time with his stepmom and father, Roland Wilson, who was a house rehabber and worked in the poorest areas in the city. Roland was concerned about the influence that Ricky Gray was having on his son. He really hoped that Ray could stay employed and keep away from Ricky Gray. That would keep him from getting into trouble. But Ray was already too far down the wrong path. Gray and Dandridge supported their drug habit by robbing people. On October 23, 1995, when Ricky was only 17, he and Ray committed several robberies back-to-back. But police quickly caught them because they were not very good at it. They sentenced Dandridge to 11 years because he had an earlier conviction for carrying a concealed weapon. Gray received 4 years for the robbery and went into a youthful offender program. In 1997, he earned his GED and was released early in 1999. Ricky found himself back in prison by March 2000. He got into a traffic accident and had abducted a man. He was actually acquitted of that charge, but when he was arrested, they found a bag of cocaine. He was given 10 years in prison, but was released early in 2005 as a reward for cooperating on another drug case. Ray Dandridge was still in prison and posted a personal ad to a prison pals list. In his first personal, he gave his stats, and he was interested in a special lady whose age, size, race, or place did not matter to him. Besides stating that he had a love for sports, movies, poetry, cooking, and working out, he also blamed his conviction on a woman. Dandridge wrote a second personal ad. Dear friends, don't judge a book by its cover. We all make mistakes. And what don't kill will only make us stronger. My friends call me Lucky. I'm 28, height 6'0", weight 215. I'm athletically built. I have 2 tattoos. I'm brown skin with baby brown eyes. I'm from Arlington and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I love to travel, dance, read, write, and play chess. I like to play basketball and football. I like most music, sports, and poetry. Yeah, poetry. And I would love to send you some of my work. I'm an open-minded and very romantic and understanding person. I believe in treating others as I want to be treated and respected in life. I'm looking for good friends and my soulmate. I'm still missing that special woman in my life. I'm hoping to correspond with a mature woman who has a sense of humor, dreams, goals, and is very open-minded and understanding. Most of all, who knows what she wants out of life, and a real man. Your age, size, and race does not matter. It's what's in your heart that counts, and what's on your mind that matters to me. I will answer all responses sent to me. Ray Dandridge, inmate number 235473. A young lady by the name of Ashley Baskerville responded to Dandridge, and they started a relationship. They released Dandridge from prison on October 26, 2005, and he was free of any type of supervision. He did not have to check in with a probation officer, and the first thing he did was hop on a Greyhound bus to go visit his uncle Ricky Gray. They started their crime spree a week and a half later. In court, the defense team hoped that the jury would have mercy regarding the capital murder charge. The jury now knew the entire backstory of Ricky Giovan Gray, but they only needed 30 minutes to decide he was guilty. Ricky Gray's mother tried to fight for her son's life during the penalty phase of the trial and told the jury that she was responsible for the neglect he suffered as a child. The jury was not persuaded by her arguments, and on August 17, 2006, they recommended Ricky Gray be sentenced to death for Stella and Ruby Harvey. For the other murders, he received life in prison. A judge confirmed his death sentence on October 23, 2006. The trial of Ray Joseph Dandridge took place after his uncle's trial, and there was much less media attention given to this event. Dandridge pleaded not guilty on September 19, 2006, but before the closing statements began, he changed his plea to guilty to avoid the death penalty. He was convicted of murder and was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Dandridge resides in the Keene Mountain Correctional Center in Oakwood, Virginia. On December 19, 2006, they indicted Gray for another murder of a 37-year-old secretary on December 18, 2005. They found her in the basement of her home, hanging from the ceiling. She had been shot, and her home was set on fire. Her name was Cheryl Warner, and she was the mother to 3 kids. A jailhouse snitch told law enforcement that Ashley Baskerville was with Gray on the night Cheryl Warner was killed. She said they followed Cheryl home from a gas station. Gray knocked on her door. Cheryl was on the phone with her father and said she would call him back because someone with car trouble was at her door. A little time passed, and her father had not heard back from her. So he called the police, and they discovered she was murdered and her house was burning. The informant also said that Ashley was afraid of Gray, and that he told her that if she ever left him, he would kill her. When Ashley and the jailhouse informant had been on the phone, Gray wanted to know who she was on the phone with, and told her that she shouldn't be talking with anyone. They charged Gray with capital murder, abduction, attempted arson, and a few gun crimes. He entered a plea of not guilty. The charge was eventually suspended because of contradictory evidence, which was never publicized. Several years passed, and Gray's appeals worked their way through the courts. His appeal was rejected in November 2015, and his execution was set for January 2016. Gray's legal team appealed to the Supreme Court, but they declined to take his case. His final execution date was set for January 18, 2017, and on the day of his execution, Gray declined his last meal. When asked if he had any last words, Gray responded with, "Nope." The mechanics of this execution were controversial. It took over 30 minutes to perform, and they drew a curtain around Gray for privacy because they cannot get the IV line inserted. Midazolam and potassium chloride were pushed through the IV line. Midazolam was also a controversial drug, and had been a problem in other executions. Some feel midazolam is an inhumane choice for an execution drug because it doesn't fully control the pain for the inmate during the potassium chloride injection. When Gray's attorney spoke to the press after the execution, he said that a firing squad would have been more humane. The Richmond, Virginia community did a few heartwarming things to keep the Harvey's memory alive. For Ruby Harvey, there was an event called Ruby's Run. This community event raised money and created a scholarship fund in her name at the preschool she attended. A new children's garden was dedicated to the memory of Stella Harvey. For Brian and Catherine Harvey, they created an endowment which supported local music and visual and performing arts. The Drive-By Truckers are an alt-country southern rock band that you might hear on a program like All Songs Considered. They dedicated a song off their Brighter Than Creation's Dark album called Two Daughters and a Beautiful Wife. If you listen to it after this podcast, I promise you'll have a hard time keeping your eyes dry. Whew. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Beyond Contempt. Please visit BeyondContemptPodcast.com for the links to the sources and the music used in this episode. Research, writing, editing, audio production, and music scoring were performed by me. Thank you to new patron, Lavita M. You didn't leave your address on Patreon, so please send it to me so I can ship you a sticker. To everyone else, if you like the show, please leave me a favorable review in Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much, everyone.